The Gemara in Shabbos tells us a very interesting halacha, which perhaps modern science might dispute, or I should say will definitely dispute. But let's see what the halacha is first, and then how do we deal with it. So the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, we know the Torah tells us there's the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbos, is known as the Lamed Tes Malachas. The Torah just says don't do malacha, and we have a tradition that it means the 39 prohibited activities. And one of the prohibitions on Shabbos is to take a life, netilas neshama. We're talking about shchita of an animal. Slaughtering an animal, doing shchita, that is prohibited on Shabbos because it violates the prohibition of netilas neshama. Of course, killing a human being as well is not only usher on Shabbos, because we don't do capital punishment on Shabbos, but it's usher all the time. You can't kill someone. But in case where, let's say, there's a mitzvah to kill the person, but we don't do it on Shabbos anyway, and as well. So the Gemara says, what happens, so are all animals equal, or insects? So the Gemara tells us, someone who kills lice on Shabbos it's permitted. It's not there's no biblical prohibition of killing lice. It'll make many parents happy who have to clean the lice. They only have to worry about pulling out hair as opposed to killing lice. But the Gemara says killing lice is permitted. So the Rambam, the Gemara goes into, and the Rambam Maimonides, who is a doctor himself, elaborates why is it that killing a cow is prohibited, but killing lice is not. So the Rambam elaborates. Anyone who knows the ABC of science knows there's something called spontaneous generation. When do we say it's prohibited to kill an animal born from a mommy, from an egg? That came from a reproduction. But something which is just born out of sweat or dirt or whatever spontaneous generation came out of, so therefore that's not in the prohibition of netilas neshama. So that's the Gemara. However, we're familiar with Louis Pasteur was his name. Well, I'll just read. Spontaneous generation is an obsolete theory regarding the origin of life from inanimate object. Would you agree it's an obsolete theory? It is generally accepted to have been ultimately disproven in the 19th century by the experiments of Louis Pasteur, expanding on the experiments of other scientists who started like in the 17th century. So basically, this as the Rambam wrote during his time, all the scientists agreed there was spontaneous generation. It's clear today it's an obsolete theory. No one believes in spontaneous generation anymore. So the question is, what do we do with the Rambam? What do we do with the Gemara? The Rambam writes it's permitted to kill lice on Shabbos because they're spontaneous generated. Now that we know that it's not true, so does the halacha change or not? So interesting, when Louis Pasteur came out, then he finally disproved it. So the communists had their own idea because they're atheists. And what do you mean? Of course, there's spontaneous generation. I have to believe who put the first animal, who put the first person down. So we know money could buy anything. They just hired a bunch of scientists or medical, and they paid them off, and they wrote a whole article saying, no, there is spontaneous generation. So when this came out, many of the rabbis were dancing in the street. Oh, great, now we have an answer. The Rambam was right. But the truth is, we all know that was just a phony study. Yeah. So back to our original question, then, what do we do? How do we learn that Gemara? So as always, there are different schools of thought. How do you deal when you have a conflict between medical science and the Gemara? So one approach is as follows. And it's similar to an approach Rav Dessler has. I'll just tell you what Rav Dessler says in a different context, and then we'll tie it into here. So there's a concept of a treifa. A treifa is an animal that it has a hole in its lung or a hole somewhere in its body, and it's going to die within the year. So the Gemara has many different examples, and it's a separate discussion, not tonight. There are many examples where the Gemara says they're a treifa, they're going to die, but modern science says, but that's not what I'm talking about now. There's a certain type of, it's called the drusa, it's a wildcat attacked this animal, and the Gemara in Chulin, during the time of the Gemara, 53a, I believe, says that there was an observational fact. When a wildcat attacked this animal, the animal would die much quicker than if some other animal attacked it. So the question is why? You know why? So I guess at the time of the Gemara, I guess they must have spoke with the scientists, or the rabbis might have been scientists themselves, and he said, you know why? It must be because the wildcats excrete or some venom, and therefore the poison gets into the animal and they die quicker. That was the understanding then. However, we know scientists say that's not true. There is no venom in a wildcat, and so what did the scientists come up with? They had come up with a different explanation. The explanation was it must be then because the claw of a wildcat goes in deeper than most other animals, and then maybe the dirt, the dying, then it gets down, dirt, infection, and the bottom line, they came up with another reason. So Rav Dessler says as follows. He says, his approach is that really when the Gemara gives a halacha, it's based on a tradition. So therefore the halacha is true. What they try to do during the time when they had the halacha, if they had a tradition, they spoke to the scientists of the day and try to come up with some theory, like, okay, why did this is the halacha, but I don't try to help me understand it. And the scientists, and then they came up, well, it must be the venom. But now we know that's not true. So Rav Dessler's approach is you preserve the halacha at the same time you encourage the study of science and going to scientists, because the halacha is not based on that. You're just you look for the modern theories, try to explain the certain halacha. So Rav Dessler has an approach like that. So whether it's not the same, but someone will explain here as well. What's the reason why would you, okay, so some will say, well, now that we know there's no spontaneous generation, you're not going to kill lice. That's what someone argues. The halacha, it's based on the science of the time. That's the Rambam's son and others, that basically there's nothing holy about the science of the time. The rabbis only knew just as much as the scientists of that time. Again, so we'll see, we're just discussing one halacha, but obviously, depending on which halacha, some might have been based on a tradition, but according to the Rambam's son and others, if it's purely based on a scientific observation, if that's not true anymore, then you drop the halacha as well. If the halacha is based on an erroneous assumption, unless you could come up with a different one. So therefore they explain as follows. There's a halacha we know there's a halacha of eating kosher, not having milk and meat. And in addition, we'll be reading in a couple of weeks, there's a prohibition of eating bugs. Not that people, I guess maybe it was,
except for locusts.
Right. So there's certain, when we had those in Israel, during Egypt over there, it was over Pesach time a couple of years ago, whatever it was. So, and that's a big chiddush to say bugs are rasa, because usually the Torah only prohibits something which is edible, but there's a special prohibition not to eat bugs. That's why you have so let's say you have bugs on vegetables, on romaine, especially now Pesach time, romaine lettuce is big. So you have to obviously you have to make sure there's no bugs on it. But as we know today, right now, as I'm talking, I might be swallowing many bugs. There's organic bugs, invisible bugs. Every moment you go, they're around. Is that true or not?
That's true.
Okay, so what do you mean? So you tell me I'm violating a biblical prohibition as we talk? So obviously not. So what the rabbis explain is, no, the Torah obviously only prohibited visible bugs. If you can't see them, so not that they're not bugs, but that wasn't when the Torah was given to human beings, not to angels, and therefore one is not
things you can detect.
Exactly, one is not obligated. One is not obligated to look at take out a microscope or some special instrument to find if there are any organic organisms around. In fact, that's what Rav Moshe writes by the laws of Nida. Let's say you're checking a cloth to see if it's red or not. So Rav Moshe writes, if the only way you can see it's red is by using a microscope, then we don't view that as a woman being needed, because then if you can't see it, or there was a story, someone came to one of the rabbis and gave him his pair of tefillin and said, are these square? Because tefillin have to be square. So the rabbi looked, they look square, they're fine. So the guy said, no, they're not square. He says, I know, I'm a dentist. I work on these fillings, and therefore I could see it. So the rabbi said to him that that's not an issue. And as a normal person, to them it's square. Your eyes are trained like an instrument, so therefore we don't go by what you see. We go by. So halakha is concerned with only visible things, not invisible things. And we see many halakhas like that. And therefore, the bugs, again, it doesn't mean, well, okay, well, I'll close my eyes and I'll eat the romaine lettuce. It's not the way, the fact that you close your eyes doesn't make it invisible. I mean, it has to be something, again, I'm not getting into the class, what's considered seeing it. Is a black spot enough? That's a separate class. But we have to conclude here. So therefore, so that's what Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and the Aruch HaShulchan, some of the classical, well, not contemporary, but they passed away, but in the past 100 years, they point out that's the explanation in the Gemara. In other words, you could, whether the Gemara thought spontaneous generation or not, maybe yes, maybe no, that's up for discussion. But the point being is, if you want to work like Rav Dessler, then now you see that's wrong, you come with the halacha. Some will say we reject the halacha and that's it. Others say no. We have to come up with a different reason. Obviously that's not, the halacha is the same, but so what's the reason? It's because obviously these eggs were so tiny in the light, no one saw them. So people said spontaneous, but it didn't mean that it was they didn't actually believe something came out of dirt, something came out of nothing. Of course, there had to be an egg, but what they're saying is just like a bug right now that I'm swallowing. Pi halakha, we view this as a halakha, not that it's really spontaneous generation. If you can't see the egg, if you can't see it's so tiny, al pi halakha, we don't consider it as growing, and therefore that's why it's perfect. But not that they believed in spontaneous generation, and that's why they say like by mushrooms. So the Gemara tells us mushrooms should make a shahakol niyeh b'dvaro, not a boer pri adaman. Question: why? Everyone knows mushrooms comes from the ground, right. But the Gemara says no. It gets its nourishment from the air, not around it, not the ground. So obviously, it's not provable. So what's the pshat? No. So obviously, we know that they get some of the nourishment from the ground. But what halakha is saying is that nourishment they get is not significant enough in halakha that we view it. Obviously, we know it grows in the ground. Yeah. So there's the halachic reality and the sometimes the physical reality. Even though, that's the pshat is of course, if we don't believe in spontaneous generation, if a halacha is based on spontaneous generation, we throw it out. The reason why the halacha is staying is because it's not based on spontaneous generation. It's based on the fact that the eggs were invisible, and therefore halacha is telling me we view it as spontaneous, but not that it actually is. And that's how we deal with this issue of the Gemara of killing lice on Shabbos.